I grew up on a small plot of red clay tucked into the folds of the Appalachian Mountains, where the morning fog clung to the hollows like a silver blanket, and the only road in our little valley was little more than two ruts carved by horse-drawn wagons. It was 1957, and my family's home, if you could call it that, was a rough-hewn log cabin with gaps that let the winter wind whistle through and summer bugs crawl in. We didn't have electricity. There was no indoor plumbing. The nearest town was a steep 5-mile walk over the ridge, and unless you had a horse or a neighbor to give you a lift, you carried your produce down the mountain in sacks on your back. In those days, life in Appalachia meant early sunrises and long days of manual labor. My father rose before dawn, lantern in hand, to tend our small fields of corn and potatoes. Mother, sturdy of frame but gentle of heart, would load her basket full of laundry and head to the houses of townfolk for wash day, returning by dusk with aching shoulders and the faint scent of the big house on her apron. We children, there were 12 of us in all, helped where we could. I remember piling into the old wooden wagon when I was barely 6, clutching a tin pail to catch the chicken eggs, and winding down the mountain path with my ankles scraping the spokes of the wheels. We were poor, but in those early years we did not know hunger. Cornbread and a handful of greens from the garden were simple fare, but we never went to bed with empty stomachs. On lucky days, Mother would bring home a sliver of salt pork from her laundry money, a rare treat that we'd fry up so crisp it cracked when you bit into it. I can still taste that first greasy bite on my tongue, the saltiness lingering like a promise that all of this hardship might someday be worth it. School was an improvisation. Our one-room church doubled as a classroom, its whitewashed walls scrawled with chalk and its pews serving as desks. Lessons began only when the neighbors could spare a few coins to pay the preacher's daughter to teach us. I learned to read by tracing my finger under the words of dusty hymnals, and I learned to write by copying scripture verses in the margins of old Bibles. Arithmetic came slow. When I reached age 9, I was pulled from lessons entirely, so I could watch my baby sister and help in the fields. If I'd been frustrated, then I only understood later how lucky I was to have even those few months of schooling. The world beyond our mountain felt distant. Radio broadcasts crackled in at night station KDKA from Pittsburgh on a good evening, with news of presidential speeches or baseball scores. Sometimes Father would let me huddle next to him and listen as the crackly announcer called the line drives and home runs of the World Series. But by the time the echo reached our valley, I could barely make out the words. More often, entertainment meant climbing apple trees with my siblings, weaving cornhusk dolls for the younger girls, and telling ghost stories by lamplight when the cicadas sang and the fireflies danced in the dark. Looking back, I see now that our isolation was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, we were free from the congestion and the noise of city life. We knew our neighbors by name. Everyone took turns hosting Sunday potlucks and barn raisings. On the other hand, there was little oversight or aid. If a family fell on hard times, if the head of household was injured in the field, or if a blight attacked the crops, there was no social worker to call, no safety net to catch us. Instead, you relied on kinship and goodwill, and you held your tongue when troubles brewed behind closed doors. Our farm was modest, a patchwork of corn rows, a small orchard of apple trees, and a chicken coop that we repaired every spring. My father worked every inch of that land, rising from sunrise to dark. He grew enough food to feed us and any extra he carried into town to sell at the market. We walked those 5 miles in all seasons, through biting winter frost, through the mud of spring, thaw through the blazing sun of summer, tripping over tree roots and slipping on moss-covered stones. Father's strong hands and weathered face were testament to a lifetime of toil. But he never complained. Mother was the backbone of our household. After her own day's work was done, she would settle by the edge of the creek with soap and washboard, scrubbing the day's grime from the clothes of wealthier families. Her fingers would grow raw, her back would ache, and still she sang hymns as she worked, because the only medicine for weariness was faith and the promise of Sunday service. Of course, these mountains required every inch of our bodies and every ounce of our spirit. There was no room for idleness. When the corn was planted, it meant every hand digging furrows and planting kernels in the hard ground. When the frost threatened the potatoes, it meant layering straw over the hills and praying for warmth. When the rains came too late or too early, it meant watching in dread as tiny shoots withered in the soil. But hardship breeds creativity. I learned to fashion dolls from husks and stones, to trap minnows in the creek with my bare hands, and to coax wildflowers into small bouquets for Mother's windowsill. In the evenings, we'd pass time swapping stories or humming old mountain ballads. I still remember the ache of my mother's voice when she sang of the hills of Mother of the Wildwood and the gentle breeze songs that carried both longing and belonging in their notes. Perhaps the greatest lesson of those years was resilience. My mother used to say, no matter how low the creek gets, it'll find a way to keep flowing. And so we did too. When the roof leaked, we patched it with tar paper. When the well ran low, we dug deeper. When illness struck even a simple fever, Father made poultices from herbs in the woods. We learned to rely on the land, on each other, and on a stubborn hope that tomorrow might be a better day. Yet beneath the strength of our daily routines lay a recklessness born of isolation. People assumed that what happened within the four logs of a cabin was no one else's concern. And so when cracks formed in the foundation of our family's safety, when secrets and sorrows festered, there was no one to hear the silent cries. That silence would prove both our sanctuary and our undoing in the years to come. By the time I turned 12, I carried not only the burden of chores, but also the weight of unspoken fears. The days of carefree play under the apple trees grew shorter and more precious, as I realized that this world of simple joys could so swiftly turn to darkness. But in those early years, I clung to every scrap of beauty: the morning mist on the fields, the laughter of my sisters, the smell of fresh-baked cornbread, because I sensed even then that tomorrow's sun might not always rise so gently. And so I learned first and foremost that survival in Appalachia was more than a matter of hard work. It was an act of faith. Faith in the land that gave us life, faith in the community that shared our burdens, and faith in something larger than ourselves that whispered, "Keep going, child." The hollow may be deep, but hope runs deeper still. When the violence began in our home, it did not arrive with a sudden crash. Instead, it crept in on soft footsteps and whispered threats, hidden behind the closed doors of a family that the outside world believed was untouchable. My earliest memory of fear came one moonless night when I was just 12. I woke to the brush of heavy boots on our dirt floor and the smell of whiskey that clung to my brother's clothes. Before I could scream, a rough hand covered my mouth. He warned me in a low voice, "If you tell, I'll hurt the baby brother next door." In our valley, the unspoken rule was clear: what happened inside those walls stayed inside. Neighbors might see our children playing in the yard, might hear our mother's soft hymns drifting on the wind, but none of us believed to look closer than that. It wasn't that people were cruel. Most of them were kind, church-going folk quick to bring casseroles when a family fell ill. But there was a line drawn at family business. To question a father's authority or to accuse a brother of wrongdoing was to invite scandal, gossip, and shame, things our community held dear to avoid at all costs. So the violence continued. My brother's apologies at dawn were nothing more than an act. He'd wipe the tears from my eyes, pretend to fuss over my torn nightgown, and promise it wouldn't happen again. My mother, exhausted by laundry and fieldwork, noticed my trembling but stifled her concern with a weary "boys will be boys" and another basin of warm water. The church provided comfort in hymn and prayer, but the ministers never broached the subject of what true safety looked like when evil was hiding in plain sight. This silence was the very thing that allowed the cycle to flourish. Abuse thrives on secrecy, on the isolation of the victim. I learned quickly that if I didn't flinch at his touch, didn't cry out, didn't leave marks, he could see, then the world would carry on as if nothing had happened. I mastered the art of a stoic face, of pretending to sleep through muffled footsteps. At school, when children teased me for my hollow cheeks or my sudden black eyes from falls off a swing, I shrugged and told them I was clumsy. Psychologists call this state learned helplessness. When you come to expect pain as the price of daily life, you stop fighting even when escape might be possible. You convince yourself that you have no power to change your circumstances. Worse, you begin to blame yourself. Perhaps you deserved it. Perhaps you brought it on. That self-blame became a cloak I wore every time my brother's voice hissed in my ear, promising worse harm if I tried to tell. Yet buried beneath my fear was a twisted form of loyalty, what experts today call trauma bonding. I saw flashes of gentleness in my abuser when he wasn't drunk, a hand placed on my shoulder, a whispered apology, the brother I remembered when we were children. In those moments, I clung to the idea that he was still my protector, that the man who planted our family's corn could not also be the one who harmed me. It was a desperate hope, as absurd as it was comforting, and it kept me from screaming for help or running away until I could no longer bear the weight of it. In the years since I've met other survivors who tell the same story, a woman in Tennessee who endured her stepfather's advances for almost a decade before her school counselor noticed her withdrawal and bruises. A young man in West Virginia who was beaten by his mother's boyfriend until a neighbor finally called Child Protective Services. Both cases ended only after anyone, broke the silence. Today, mandated reporting laws and 24/7 hotlines provide a lifeline. But back then, we had nothing but our own broken voices. The mistakes our community made were common. We looked away to preserve the appearance of stability. We discouraged children from airing dirty laundry. We told ourselves that family was sacrosanct, that love justified our blind spots. But every expert I've spoken to teaches the same lesson. Ignoring the signs only deepens the scars. A child who is withdrawn, who flinches when touched, who becomes anxious around certain relatives. Those are cries for help, even if unspoken. I wish someone had told me then that it was okay to tell, that I had the right to safety, that I was not to blame. But instead, I got more threats, more punishment if I tried to speak. My grades slipped, my laughter faded. I wondered if I would ever remember the sound of my own voice. When I finally escaped by the skin of my teeth and a prayer of desperation, I understood the true power of breaking silence. The first thing I did when I found refuge in that convent was confess my fear out loud to Sister Grace. Her arms wrapped around me and didn't let go. She called a doctor, arranged a warm meal, and told me, "What happened to you was not your fault." Those words became my anchor. In the decades since I have turned those lessons into action. At the children's home I help run, we teach every staff member to watch for signs, sudden changes in behavior, unexplained injuries, withdrawal from social activities. We conduct background checks not only on new employees but also on volunteers, and we insist on pairing every child with a mentor who has passed extensive training. We believe that transparency is the best shield against abuse. For families, the most common mistake still lies in assuming that it can't happen here. I've spoken at PTA meetings where parents bristle at the suggestions that they should learn how to spot grooming behaviors, or that they should have child protection plans in place. They worry it will create paranoia. But I remind them vigilance is not paranoia. It is love with open eyes. Therapy plays a crucial role too. Survivors need more than safe houses, they need healing. Cognitive behavioral therapy helps reframe self-blame. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing EMDR works through the trauma at a neurological level. Group support can break the isolation. When I first sat in a circle of women who had endured similar horrors, I felt for the first time that I was part of something that could not be erased. Recovering from the bonds of trauma takes time. I still have days when the past shadows my thoughts, but I have learned to recognize the signs of creeping despair and to reach out to a friend, to a counselor, to prayer. My own journey taught me that healing is not a straight line. It is a tapestry of forward steps and occasional regressions. If I could share one lesson from those dark years, it would be this. Do not confuse family loyalty with secrecy. Love does not demand your silence. A hug should not come with a threat. If your child or your neighbor's child shows signs of fear, speak up. If your heart tells you something is wrong, follow it. The voice you save may be the very one that needs to tell its story. And to anyone who finds themselves trapped, remember you deserve to be safe. Your story matters. You are worthy of help, of justice, and of peace. It may seem impossible to believe that beyond this world of hurt, there lies a future filled with possibility. But I stand here to tell you that hope can grow even in the deepest darkness, and that breaking the silence is the first step toward reclaiming your life. I remember the night I stumbled through the heavy wooden doors of St. Mary's Convent, as though I were being pulled by unseen hands. My body was trembling with exhaustion and pain. My clothes soaked with the blood of a miscarriage, crushed from me by months of fear and flight. The sanctuary I found in that vast, silent hall of stone and dim candlelight felt like stepping into another world, one where harm could not follow. One where the only echoes were the hushed footsteps of nuns and the distant toll of the chapel bell. Sister Grace was waiting. She wore her habit like a second skin, simple white wimple framing a kind face, black veil falling to her shoulders. Without a word, she came to me, arms outstretched. I collapsed into her embrace and felt for the first time in years a tremor of relief. She guided me to a low pew at the back, where I sank to the floor, too spent even to kneel. She held my hand and pressed a cool cloth to my forehead. "Safe," she whispered. "You are safe here." Over the next days, the convent became both home and hospital. The other sisters, Sister Agnes, Sister Teresa, and Sister Louise, moved around me with gentle efficiency. They brought me broth and warm wraps for my bruises. A doctor from town visited, examined me in the convent infirmary, and pronounced that I'd had a miscarriage brought on by stress and overwork. But beyond attending to my body, the sisters tended my spirit. They lit candles at dawn and dusk, inviting me to join their prayers or to simply sit in silent fellowship. No questions, no judgment. I watched their routines, the quiet ritual of cleaning the chapel, the measured cadence of the divine office, the hours spent in the vegetable garden, coaxing tomatoes and basil from rocky soil. Their devotion was not just to God, but to each other, and to any hurting soul who crossed their threshold. In that structured life, I found a freedom I had never known, freedom from terror, from shame, from the tyranny of my own breath, catching at every shadow. Yet the same institution that offered me refuge had its own complexities. When I first whispered fragments of my past abuse by my brothers, the birth of my daughter in a shed, the loss of both our lives to secrecy. Sister Grace listened with tears in her eyes. Then came a moment of hesitation from Mother Superior, an acknowledgement that the convent's walls, though high, could not fully block the world's attentions. We talked about the need for discretion, that the asylum the sisters provided must not become a target for the men who hunted me, but equally must not become a hidden trap where other dangers lurked. It was early in my stay that I learned of the two-door policy. No lay visitor could enter the private wing without an escort. No child could ever be left alone with a single sister. For every ministry of mercy, this convent performed sheltering orphans, feeding the hungry, providing basic education. They also understood that vulnerability demanded safeguards. Each volunteer underwent a background check. Every nun's quarters was accessible only through supervised corridors. I saw this protocol firsthand when I escorted Sister Teresa to the orphanage next door, and she escorted me back, keeping me safe as if I were her own sister. Still, faith alone cannot guarantee safety. I heard whispered stories of other convents elsewhere in Appalachia, and beyond, where the very structure meant to protect had abused its power. Sisters who punished children for asking questions, priests who skirted accountability walls that muffled cries rather than amplifying them. My own horror had been born of an over-reliance on family privacy. I would not allow faith to become another cover for violence. In conversations with Sister Grace, we resolved that our sanctuary would be transparent. Ours would be a refuge that welcomed scrutiny, that invited social workers, medical professionals, and concerned laypeople to partner in our work. Out in the bright daylight, I began to rebuild my trust in community. When I sat at a worn wooden table alongside Sisters Agnes and Mary Ann to mend their vestments, I listened as they spoke of their families, their callings, their own struggles with doubt. I told them of the night my brother's footsteps froze outside my bedroom door, of how I held a piece of cloth in my mouth to stifle my crying. Each word peeled back another layer of fear. They did not flinch. They nodded as if to say, "We see you and you are not alone." My healing included education. Sisters who ran the convent school offered me classes in literature, grammar, and arithmetic that I'd missed out on as a child. Sister Grace tutored me in shorthand and bookkeeping so I could manage records at the orphanage. The convent library, modest but lovingly curated, became my sanctuary within a sanctuary. I read biographies of women who rose from humble beginnings, treatises on child psychology, the notebooks of social reformers who believed that society had a duty to its most vulnerable. With each page, my sense of possibility grew. But perhaps the most profound lesson came through service. The convent ran a small orphanage for children rescued from broken homes. Under the watchful eyes of two nuns, I joined the daily routine feeding toddlers their morning milk. Teaching a group of 8-year-olds how to plant basil in spring, reading bedtime stories about saints and sailors and dreams. I saw in those children the same fear I once felt, the same need for protection and kindness. And in serving them, I found my purpose. The convent had saved me. Now I could help save others. My faith deepened not as a set of rules, but as a conviction that every human being bore the imprint of the divine, and that mercy was our highest calling. Yet I also recognized that spirituality without accountability can become a cloak for injustice. I insisted that the orphanage hold regular meetings with a social worker from the county, that we keep open records, that each child have access to medical exams and psychological counseling. No secret, no hush money, only transparency and compassion. Years later, as I prepared to leave the convent's protective walls and begin a new chapter leading that children's home, I carried with me both gratitude and caution. Gratitude for the sisters, who had held me when I was broken, who taught me the power of prayer when words failed. and caution and awareness that any institution, however well-intentioned, can harbor blind spots if it refuses collaboration with the wider community. In countless talks I've given since at churches, schools, and shelters, I tell my audience that faith can be a fortress or a prison, depending on how it is practiced. A fortress when it safeguards those in need and invites accountability. A prison when it wraps itself in secrecy and ignores the cries for help. My own journey showed me both faces. In the convent, I felt my spirit unclench. I learned that sanctuary is not passive, but an active choice to protect, to listen, and to heal. Now, whenever I step inside a chapel, any chapel, I say a quiet prayer of thanks. Not just for the God I serve, but for the sisters of Pinciol who reminded me that love is never silent. It speaks up for the voiceless. It turns towards suffering rather than away. It welcomes outsiders to help build the walls of safety rather than barring the gate. That is the complex, beautiful role faith can play, a light shining in the dark, but only if we open all the shutters of Pebkas and let it shine on every corner. And so when I look back on that frightened 12-year-old girl running for her life, I do not see only pain. I see the first glimmer of a conviction that would carry me forward as that sanctuary as possible. But it requires courage from those who need it and from those who offer it. In my next chapter, I will share how that conviction grew into a mission to transform not just one convent's walls, but the hearts and minds of an entire community, so that no child need ever run alone again. I arrived at the small orphanage adjacent to the convent with trembling hands and a heart full of questions. Sister Agnes had invited me to help with the morning chores, but as I stepped over the threshold, I realized I was crossing into a different kind of battlefield, one where innocence, bruised by life's harshest blows, still clung to hope. The children ranged from toddlers to early teens, each face etched with stories I recognized all too well. There was Henry, who at 8 would flinch whenever you reached to touch his shoulder. Maria, 10, whose laughter never quite reached her eyes. And little Tommy, 4, who rocked back and forth in a corner clutching a ragged teddy bear. In their quiet corners, I saw reflections of my own terror-filled years. My first assignment was simple serve breakfast. I lined up bowls of oatmeal on the long wooden table and watched as the children filed in. They pushed their chairs close to the table's edge, eyes downcast. I poured warm milk into each bowl, stirring in bits of brown sugar and cinnamon, small comforts I had once longed for during the darkest nights. As I set a bowl before Henry, his hand shook. I knelt beside him and said softly, "Would you like to add a sprinkle of sugar?" His nod was so barely perceptible I almost missed it. When I handed him the sugar bowl, his fingers closed around mine for a moment, a tiny act of trust that felt like a lifeline. In those early days, I witnessed more than physical wounds. I saw children who had been told they were worthless, who had learned to hide pain rather than speak it. I realized that healing required something deeper than bread or blankets. It required understanding. Drawing on my own journey through silence and shame, I proposed that we adopt a trauma-informed care approach. Every interaction would be based on safety, trustworthiness, choice, collaboration, and empowerment. We began with staff training. Over cups of tea in the convent parlor, I shared what I had learned about trauma's fingerprints on the brain, how a single frightening ordeal could set off the body's alarm system for years, how a child might react with aggression or withdrawal, not out of choice, but out of survival instinct. We learned to replace the question, "What's wrong with you?" with "What happened to you?" so that our language would validate experiences rather than stigmatize behaviors. For example, when Maria hissed at the other girls for moving her doll, she wasn't being mean, She was protecting a prized possession, a symbol of control in a world where she felt powerless. When Tommy refused to let volunteers hold him, he wasn't being ungrateful. He didn't yet know that hands could bring comfort rather than pain. Recognizing these truths allowed us to respond with compassion rather than punishment. We redesigned the orphanage space to reflect this philosophy. We added quiet corners with soft rugs, pillows, and weighted blankets for moments when a child felt overwhelmed. We painted bright murals on the walls, sunflowers reaching toward the sky, doves in flight, to remind the children that beauty could exist even after hardship. We turned the backyard into a healing garden with raised beds for planting vegetables and herbs. Tending to living things taught patience and nurtured a sense of achievement. Even the most withdrawn child could coax green shoots from the earth and take pride in the result. Group circles became our ritual. Twice each week, the entire orphanage gathered in a spacious room, sitting in a wide circle of small chairs. We started each session with check-ins, where every child shared one word about how they felt that morning. Often the words were sad, angry, or tired, and we honored each confession with a nod and empathy. Then, with the help of a local child psychologist who volunteered her time, we introduced simple coping tools, deep breathing exercises, drawing feelings on paper, writing short notes of encouragement to oneself. One rainy afternoon, as I watched Henry trace shaky lines on a sheet of paper, I knelt beside him again. He looked up, eyes brimming with tears. "I don't know why I feel scared all the time," he whispered. I offered him the paper and said, "Sometimes our hearts remember things before our words can catch up. It's okay if you don't have the words right now." I pulled out a box of crayons and drew a small sun in the margin. "This sun's you," I told him. "Even when clouds come, you're still shining inside." He glanced at me, the tight knot in his chest loosening just a bit. Mistakes inevitably surfaced. In our early zeal, we removed all rules about bedtime, thinking that strict schedules would re-traumatize. Instead, chaos reigned. Children stayed up late, crying for attention. We learned that structure, when delivered with kindness rather than cruelty, can be another form of safety. So we reinstated a predictable evening routine: light snack, at 6 quiet play until 7. Brief reading circle, then lights out. It wasn't rigid, it was reliable. The children knew that at lights out, they could expect soft voices, gentle lullabies, and the confidence that we would not disappear in the dark. Another misstep was assuming that every child was ready to join our group circles. Some retreated or refused to sit. We had to accept that healing is not linear and that each soul required its own pace. We created choice boards where children could pick from activities: art, gardening, supervised free play, or quiet corner. Offering choice meant they regained agency over their lives, a critical component of rebuilding trust. As months passed, small transformations revealed themselves. Maria began to laugh. Truly laugh when Sister Marianne led an art project. Tommy let Sister Teresa tuck him in at nap time. Henry asked for more sugar in his oatmeal with a confident grin. Their growth was neither smooth nor uniform, but a mosaic of progress and setbacks. I kept a small notebook of bright spots to share at staff meetings, so that when frustration loomed, we could remember that change was happening one fragile step at a time. Behind every breakthrough was a lesson learned that healing children required a community, not just caregivers. We invited retirees from town: the retired teacher who ran reading sessions, the nurse who taught basic hygiene, the former carpenter who helped build garden boxes. We partnered with local schools to ease transitions so that each child had a home-based teacher who understood their history. We even started a buddy program linking each orphanage child with a college volunteer who visited once a week for homework help and a friendly ear. The wider community became part of the safety net, demonstrating that it truly did take a village. One day, as I walked through the healing garden with Sister Grace, I paused by a row of young basil plants. I reached down to brush a leaf and inhaled its sweet, peppery scent, a reminder of life's small miracles. "Look how far they've come," I said softly. Sister Grace smiled. "And so have you," she replied. "From a frightened girl running for her life to the heart of this place. You've brought your pain and turned it into purpose." In her words, I recognized the truth. My own path to healing was inseparable from my work with these children. At the end of my first year at the orphanage, I hosted a small harvest festival in the convent courtyard. The tables were lined with soup made from our garden vegetables, fresh cornbread and pies sweetened with berries picked by the children. Families from the surrounding hills came bringing casseroles and laughter. The children performed a short play about sunflowers growing toward the sky, an allegory of their own journeys. When the final curtain fell, applause rang out, mingled with tears of pride and relief. In that moment, I realized how far we had come, not just as an institution, but as a community. The convent's walls no longer just sheltered. They radiated warmth and collaboration. I thought back to the frightened child who collapsed into Sister Grace's arms in the chapel and felt gratitude for every step that had followed. My own revival had become a beacon for others, and together we had woven a new story, one where trauma did not define destiny. Now, as I prepare to share this story with a broader audience, I carry with me a simple truth that resilience lives in the meeting of vulnerability and caring. When trauma-informed care is woven into everyday life, when empathy guides action and every child is treated as a keeper of sacred trust, healing is possible. My next chapter will explore how these lessons rippled beyond our garden gates, shaping policy training other caregivers and inspiring movements that reached far beyond our little valley. But for now, I hold tight to the images of laughter echoing through the courtyard, to the scent of basil in my fingers, and to the knowledge that every broken heart can learn to beat again. I stood beneath the old oak tree in the convent courtyard, its branches outstretched like an embrace, and I thought of how far we'd come. From the frightened 12-year-old running barefoot under a moonless sky to this moment where laughter and music filled the air, where children danced freely without fear. Our journey had taught me that healing does not end with individual survival. It ripples outward, touching neighbors, shaping communities, and even changing laws. As I look ahead now, I carry not only memories of my past, but also a vision for a future where no child must suffer in silence, and every adult learns to recognize their power to help. When I first escaped into the convent's embrace, I could scarcely have imagined that one day I would stand here encouraging a gathering of local families, volunteers, and neighbors to join me in building a culture of protection. Yet that is exactly what has happened. The garden beds we tilled together have turned into classrooms under the sun, not just for planting basil and tomatoes, but for planting seeds of awareness. At weekly community circle events, parents share stories of small victories, like spotting the first sign of distress in a shy child, or having the courage to ask a question when something felt off. They learn that disclosure of abuse need not be an act of vengeance, but a step towards safety and healing. For any family grappling with the fear that it can't happen here, I offer simple, concrete steps. First, recognize that creating safety starts at home. Establish safety plans for your children, designate trusted adults they can turn to both within and beyond the family. Practice code words that signal a need for help, so that in any emergency, even when children cannot speak freely, they have a lifeline. Second model. Open communication, ask regularly. How do you feel today? Is there anything that makes you uncomfortable? Listen without judgment and respond with empathy. A child who feels heard is infinitely more likely to speak up. I remember a mother named Elaine, a single parent in our Appalachia outreach program, who told me that after our workshops, she began tucking her son into bed each night with a simple question: "Is there anything you're afraid of?" Her son paused, thought for a moment, and said he was afraid of the handyman who fixed their leaky roof. Because she asked Elaine, uncovered a pattern of boundary-crossing behavior that might otherwise have gone unreported. She confronted her fear, contacted the local child advocacy center, and prevented further harm. Her courage became a testament to the fact that the smallest question spoken with genuine care can save a life. Beyond individual action, I have seen policy make a difference when communities unite. In our county, we lobbied for a mandatory reporting law that lowers the age threshold at which professionals must report suspected abuse. Teachers, coaches, and clergy are now legally required to notify authorities if they suspect harm, even if the evidence is indirect. Resistance came at first. Some worried it would flood the system with paperwork or lead to false accusations. But after several training sessions where social workers walked through real-life scenarios where survivors shared the pain of delayed intervention, opposition softened. Today, the law has created a safety net that catches more children before they fall. If you wish to take similar action, consider forming or joining a local advocacy group. Reach out to your state representative and ask them to co-sponsor bills strengthening child protective services. Attend town hall meetings, share data on how timely reports reduce trauma, and bring forward the stories of those whose lives were saved by early intervention. It may feel daunting, but change often begins with a handful of determined people gathering signatures on a petition or simply asking their neighbors to write letters. The ripple grows until it becomes a wave. I've also learned that support for survivors cannot end at disclosure. They need comprehensive resources, therapy, medical care, safe housing, educational support. That's why I partnered with a network of non-profits to create a one-stop center in our region. There, a family can access counseling, legal advice, tutoring, and peer support groups all under one roof. When a survivor named David arrived aged 17, he found himself falling through the cracks, bounced between clinics, waiting for weeks to see a psychologist. At our center, he was seen within days. He began trauma-informed therapy, got help catching up on coursework, and even learned to play guitar in a music workshop designed for emotional expression. Today, David mentors younger teens who've had similar experiences, transforming his own healing into an act of giving back. In building such centers, communities must remember to cultivate trained volunteers as well. We hold quarterly protect and serve training for anyone willing: retirees, college students, local business owners, so they know how to recognize signs of trauma, how to listen without judgment, and when to refer a child to professional services. These volunteers become ambassadors of safety in schools, libraries, and sports clubs. Their presence reminds families that support is not scarce, but abundant, that help is not hidden, but right around the corner. Another lesson our journey has taught me is the value of public education campaigns that destigmatize conversations about abuse. At first, when we put up posters in the grocery store and on the school bulletin boards, images of children with the headline, "Every child deserves a safe home," some shrugged, others rolled their eyes. But as local radio hosts invited survivors to share brief testimonials, and as youth groups wrote and performed songs about courage and hope, the campaign took root. Now on Facebook and in town newsletters, I see parents sharing informational pamphlets and teens tagging friends with messages like, "You're never alone." Language that was once taboo has become part of everyday dialogue, and that makes all the difference. If you'd like to start something similar, begin with digital outreach. Share posts about National Child Abuse Prevention Month. April spotlight local hotlines like 1-800 4A Child. And make sure your social media circles know the nationwide crisis hotline 988 for any mental health emergency. Encourage schools to host Speak Up assemblies, where trained facilitators run age-appropriate workshops. When children hear that it's normal and right to speak out, the weight of secrecy loses its power. Finally, I believe the most enduring change comes from cultivation of compassion in young people. We started a youth ambassadors program in middle schools where students volunteer at the orphanage, help plant our healing garden, and attend a peer-led workshop on consent and boundaries. They learn to ask for permission before touching a friend's shoulder, before taking a photo, so that respect becomes second nature. I once watched a girl named Jasmine gently say, "May I hug you," to a new foster child at our summer camp. That simple question, that respect for personal space, was a powerful lesson in empathy that stretched far beyond the campfire circle. As we look to the horizon, I see a tapestry woven from acts big and small. The lawmaker drafting new legislation, the teacher noticing a change in a pupil's demeanor, the parent asking a nightly question, the volunteer offering an hour of presence. Each thread strengthens the safety net beneath our children's feet. Our history may be stained by the silence that once shrouded our home, but our future can be bright lit by the courage of communities willing to speak up, to act, and to hold each other close. So let us pledge here under this oak tree where my journey began that we will carry these lessons forward. Let us build neighborhoods where every adult asks, "Is this child safe?" Let us train our institutions, schools, churches, clinics to be beacons of vigilance and compassion. Let us remember that healing is not a solitary path, but a shared one, where each of us plays a vital part. And to every survivor reading these words, know that your story matters. Your voice can guide others out of the dark. Your courage can spark change. You are never alone, for we stand with you in living rooms, in state capitals, in community centers, and on the internet. United by a simple truth: every child deserves a life filled not with fear, but with possibility. Let us take these steps together, hand in hand, toward a future where silence is broken and hope speaks loudest of all.